The clock flashed 2:59 a.m. as Ellie stood on the edge of the dimly lit subway platform, the cold biting at her skin, her breath visible in the air, each exhale fading into the night. The station was silent. Too silent, she thought, as her eyes scanned the empty platform, the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead creating a disorienting hum that felt like the pulse of the city itself. The last train of the night was always quiet, but this silence, this utter emptiness, made her feel something else entirely. The walls of the subway station, worn and chipped from years of use, seemed to close in on her, pressing her into the reality of an hour when most of the world was sound asleep, wrapped in the warmth of blankets and the fog of dreams. Ellie wasn't asleep. She never was at this hour. It had become routine for her, this late-night ride, this escape from a world that never quite felt like home. But tonight, something was different. She couldn't place it, but the atmosphere felt off, heavy, as if the very air around her was holding its breath. She checked her watch again, though she already knew what time it was, 2:59 a.m., and waited for the sound of the train's approach, a rumbling that echoed faintly from the tunnel, slowly growing louder. The seconds ticked away, one after another, stretching into eternity, until, at last, the train emerged from the darkness like a phantom, its headlights slicing through the gloom. The doors hissed open with a smooth, mechanical sound, and Ellie hesitated for only a moment. There was no one else around, just the flickering lights, the emptiness, and the promise of a journey that would take her to the other side of the city. She stepped forward, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders, the cold seeping into her bones. She walked onto the train, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous car as the doors closed behind her with a soft whoosh, sealing her in. The train lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the tracks, and Ellie took a seat near the middle, her eyes scanning the car. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of the car. It was empty, save for a handful of passengers, all seated in silence, their faces obscured by the darkness. She couldn't make out their features, just shadowy outlines, hunched figures, still and unmoving. There was an odd tension in the air, a thick, suffocating stillness that hung over everything. Ellie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around, but no one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the others were asleep, or perhaps they were waiting for something. The train picked up speed, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks becoming the only sound in the car, and Ellie looked out the window. The stations passed by, one after another, the familiar names scrolling across the sign: Riverbend, Oakwood, Park Street. But the train never slowed, never stopped long enough for her to recognize where they were, or to determine whether they were following their usual route. It was as though the train was slipping through some other dimension, moving at a pace beyond the natural world, a place where time itself didn't quite make sense. The stops blurred together, the lights flashing by like ghostly apparitions in the night. Ellie's stomach churned, a sense of unease growing in her chest. Something wasn't right. The passengers remained still, their eyes never leaving her, their faces shrouded in darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting for her to do something, anything. She felt the weight of their gaze pressing against her, but whenever she tried to look at one of them directly, their faces remained hidden, as if the darkness itself was consuming them. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her fingers tapping nervously against her knee. She had taken this train 1,000 times before, but tonight, it felt different. It felt like the train wasn't really moving, as if they were simply passing through empty space, through some kind of liminal zone where nothing was real, and nothing was ever going to change. The train continued to rumble on, but there were no more stops, no familiar announcements, no sound from the conductor. She looked toward the front of the car, toward the driver's booth, but the door was shut, and there was no sign of the conductor. Ellie felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She rose from her seat, her feet unsteady, and walked down the length of the car, her footsteps muffled by the sound of the train's constant motion. The passengers didn't move. Not one of them acknowledged her presence as she passed. She tried the door to the next car, but it wouldn't open. She rattled the handle, feeling a sense of panic rising in her chest. Why weren't they stopping? Why hadn't they reached the end of the line yet? The train kept moving, faster now, the lights flickering above her head, casting strange, jerky shadows across the walls. She tried to steady her breathing, but the sensation of being trapped, of being enclosed in this endless journey, was beginning to consume her. The car lurched again, and Ellie stumbled, grabbing onto one of the poles to steady herself. She turned to look at the windows, but the view outside was a blur of darkness. She couldn't see the world outside anymore. It was as if they were floating in some kind of void, suspended in time. She couldn't remember when they had last stopped. The train was moving too fast, and the stations, once so familiar, had become nothing more than fleeting glimpses in the dark. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted and garbled, but Ellie could make out the words, "Next stop, lost." Ellie's blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as a chill swept through the car. Her eyes darted from one shadowy figure to another, each one still and unmoving. They were all watching her now, their faces hidden beneath the flickering lights. She stumbled back toward her seat, feeling the weight of their gaze, but no one spoke. No one moved. The train continued to race through the darkness, and Ellie was left with a growing sense of dread, an awful, suffocating certainty that she was never going to reach the end of the line, that she was never going to escape. The train was taking her somewhere she couldn't understand, somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She had boarded it for a simple ride home, but now, it felt like the last ride she would ever take. The train continued on, its destination a mystery, its passengers silent in their shadows. And Ellie was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Ellie's pulse hammered in her throat, the cold sweat of fear sticking to her skin as the train continued its relentless journey, speeding through the darkened void of the tunnel. She could feel the rhythmic, unnatural sway of the car beneath her, as if the train were moving through thick air, thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel pressing in around her. The words, "Next stop, lost," echoed in her mind, looping like a mantra, making her stomach twist with unease. She glanced around, but the passengers in the car remained unnervingly still, their faces cloaked in shadow, their eyes unblinking, unseen. No one made a sound, not even the faintest breath or rustle of clothing. It was as though the train had become a tomb, each passenger a forgotten soul, their spirits trapped in the inescapable loop of this train's strange, otherworldly journey. Ellie's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat loud in her ears as she tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps she had fallen asleep without realizing it. Perhaps she was dreaming. It had to be a dream. But the train's motion, the stuttering of the lights, the cold metal of the seats, the harsh buzzing of the overhead lights, was too real, too tangible for her to believe that. This couldn't be a dream. This couldn't be real. She tried to push the panic down, tried to focus on something, anything, that would keep her grounded in the moment. Her hand gripped the edge of her seat, nails biting into the fabric as she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up, but when she opened them again, nothing had changed. The same silent passengers sat before her, their heads tilted at strange angles, unmoving, their hands resting limply in their laps. She felt a strange compulsion to speak to them, to shake them awake, to ask them if they knew what was going on, but each time she looked at them, a shudder ran down her spine, as if their very stillness carried a warning, an unspoken message not to disturb them. But Ellie wasn't sure if it was her fear speaking or some instinct deep inside her, urging her to keep quiet, to keep her distance. She didn't want to know who they were, or worse, what they were. A deep, gnawing instinct told her that these were not people she could help. They were not passengers, not in the way she understood it. They were something else. The train jolted again, and Ellie lost her balance, stumbling against one of the poles that lined the car. She caught herself just in time, but the motion had made her lose track of the world outside. She stepped back to the window, hoping to glimpse something familiar, but the darkness outside the glass was suffocating, like an impenetrable void that swallowed any light. No stars, no streetlights, no sign of the world she knew. There was only blackness. The train continued its journey into the abyss, a sense of timelessness stretching out before her. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, hoping for some indication that they were on the right track, that there was a destination waiting ahead. But nothing. The only certainty was the oppressive silence inside the car. A voice crackled on the intercom again, softer this time, almost as though it were coming from a great distance. All passengers must remain seated. The words made her stomach lurch, and for a moment, she wondered if the voice was speaking directly to her, as if it knew she was considering fleeing. Remain seated, the words repeated in her mind like an incantation. Ellie sank back into her seat, her eyes darting to the figures around her. No one had moved, no one had stirred. Still, the sensation of being watched never faded. She could feel their eyes on her, hidden in the shadows, the weight of their gaze pressing against her like a suffocating fog. She needed to understand. She needed to break the silence somehow, to force an answer from one of them. The need for answers, the desperate yearning to know what was happening, grew unbearable. Ellie rose again, her legs unsteady, her heartbeat thundering in her ears as she made her way toward the closest passenger. The figure was a man, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his posture was too perfect, too still. She stopped a few feet away from him, her breath shallow, and called out, her voice breaking the unnatural stillness of the train. "Excuse me? Are you okay? Do you know what's going on? Why are we?" She cut off mid-sentence as his head shifted just slightly, his eyes flickering toward her from under the hood of his coat. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it sent a cold wave of dread through Ellie's chest. She took a step back, her mouth dry, and when his eyes met hers, dark and fathomless, like the depth of a forgotten well, she froze. There was something empty in his gaze, a void that seemed to pull at her, something that whispered to her that this man, this figure, wasn't fully human. His lips parted, and for a split second, Ellie thought he might speak, that he might answer her questions, but instead, he merely exhaled, a slow, raspy breath that sounded almost like a sigh, and then closed his eyes again. And just like that, he became motionless once more, his body locked in place, as though time had paused around him. Ellie stumbled backward, heart racing, and her mind screamed at her to run, to flee, but her legs wouldn't move. The other passengers remained as they were, silent, still, and so utterly unbothered by the strange events unfolding. The train rattled on, its path undisturbed by the unsettling scene inside the car, as if none of them mattered, just passengers on an endless journey to nowhere. A cold sweat coated her skin, and Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the train wasn't taking her home. No, it was taking her somewhere far worse, somewhere she was never meant to go. She looked around the car again, her eyes falling on the other figures, each one as still and lifeless as the man she had just approached. There was an overwhelming sensation of being trapped, an understanding that she couldn't escape, that there was no way off this train, no way to undo the mistake of boarding it. Ellie returned to her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. The train was not just a mode of transportation, it was a vessel, and she was its passenger, her fate tied to the endless tracks ahead. And in that moment, Ellie understood that the train didn't just travel through the city. It traveled through time and space, between realities, between moments where the living and the dead collided in one endless, uninterrupted journey. She was no longer just traveling home. She was lost, trapped in the void, with no end in sight. Ellie's heart thudded in her chest as the train continued its relentless journey through the suffocating darkness, the oppressive silence around her stretching on and on. She sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the armrest, her eyes darting to the shadowy figures surrounding her, each one as still as the last. The movement of the train seemed to be growing more erratic, the soft rattling of the tracks becoming a dissonant screech that vibrated through her bones, making her stomach twist in discomfort. The lights overhead flickered again, the pale, sickly glow casting strange, angular shadows that seemed to stretch and contort, warping the shape of the car. It was like the world outside the windows had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the same black void that now surrounded her, leaving her with only the unshakable feeling of being lost in a place where time and space no longer made sense. The station stops had become indistinct, their names no longer announced over the intercom, and Ellie was beginning to wonder if the train had even stopped at all in the last few minutes, or hours, perhaps. Her mind reeled with the realization that she had no idea how long she had been on this train, how far it had taken her from her life. The idea of leaving it, of stepping off and returning to something familiar, something tangible, seemed like a distant fantasy now, out of her reach. A part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers from the silent passengers, but each time her gaze met theirs, the same hollow emptiness stared back at her. They were unblinking, their expressions unreadable, their bodies rigid with stillness. It was as though they were statues, frozen in time, but their eyes, those dark, endless voids, seemed to follow her, never leaving her for a moment. Then, just as she thought she might go mad from the sheer isolation, she heard it. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the train, but unmistakable. A whisper. Her head snapped to the side, her heart skipping a beat, but the train car remained just as it had been, silent and still, the passengers unchanged. The whispering persisted, a soft murmur coming from somewhere behind her, like a distant conversation just out of reach. She stood abruptly, her knees wobbling with the weight of fear, and turned to face the row of seats behind her. She could see nothing, just the same dark figures, their heads tilted down, their eyes shadowed beneath the low light. But the whispers, they were there, growing louder now, though still indistinct, like the soft rustling of pages, or perhaps a wind carrying fragmented words from some forgotten place. Her breath hitched in her throat as she leaned closer to one of the passengers, a woman whose hands rested on her lap, her fingers curled in a way that seemed unnatural. Ellie's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she realized something about her. The way her clothes were frayed, the way her face, half hidden in shadow, seemed to sag, as though it had been worn away by time. The woman's eyes flicked upward, meeting Ellie's gaze for just a fraction of a second, and Ellie froze, her blood running cold. The whispering stopped abruptly, as if the woman had turned off some invisible switch, but the silence that followed was heavier, deeper, and more suffocating than before. Ellie took a step back, her heart racing. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. The passengers, these figures, these silent ghosts, they weren't just passengers. They were something else, something far worse. They were waiting. She could feel it now, this dreadful, suffocating presence in the car, this weight pressing against her chest. The train lurched again, and this time, the motion wasn't just mechanical. It was violent, a sudden jolt that threw Ellie against the wall of the car. The lights flickered wildly, flashing in staccato bursts, and she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, something moving, something that shouldn't be there. Her breath hitched as she turned, her eyes scanning the car for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The figures hadn't shifted, hadn't stirred. Still silent. But the whispers, they were back, now swirling around her, words she couldn't quite understand, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, dissonant, broken. Her head spun, and she stumbled forward, the train jerking violently again, as if it were on the edge of coming apart. And then there it was. A single word, clear as day, whispered right into her ear, "Leave." Ellie's body stiffened, her pulse hammering as the voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, the word echoing in her mind like a command. She spun around, but there was no one there, no one close enough to have spoken. The passengers remained just as they were, frozen in their seats, their vacant eyes watching her. A strange impulse took over her, and before she could stop herself, she found her legs moving toward the nearest door, her hand reaching for the handle. The need to get off the train, to escape the suffocating air and the suffocating silence, was overwhelming. The handle clicked under her fingers, but the door didn't budge. She rattled it, pulled at it desperately, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. "Please let me off." There was no response, no change. Only the hollow silence, the endless hum of the train moving through the darkness, carrying her further into an unknown that she couldn't escape. She stepped back, her legs shaking beneath her, her eyes scanning the car again. The train didn't just feel wrong, it was wrong. The longer she stayed on it, the more she felt like she was slipping into something else, something that was neither life nor death. There was no going back, no undoing the choice to step onto this train. But there had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything, that could break the cycle, that could make this night end. The whispers came again, this time clearer, more distinct. You can never leave. The words sliced through her like a knife, sharp and cold. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her mind reeling. Never leave. The voice seemed to swirl in her mind, wrapping around her like a suffocating thread. She had heard the phrase before, but this time it was different. This time she understood. The passengers weren't passengers at all. They were lost souls, trapped in this endless cycle, waiting for the next to join them, waiting for the next one to make the mistake she had made. Ellie's pulse raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The train wasn't just a vehicle, it was a prison. A prison for the lost, for those who had no other place to go. And now, she was one of them. As the train surged forward into the darkness, Ellie's body trembled with the weight of the revelation. The intercom crackled once more, but this time, the voice was even more distorted, the words broken and incomplete, like a cry from somewhere deep beneath the earth. You never leave. The train lurched again, faster now, the sound of the tracks beneath them becoming deafening, a constant rumble that seemed to drown out everything else. Ellie felt herself sink into her seat, her eyes searching for any shred of hope, any way out. But the walls of the car felt like they were closing in, the shadows growing darker, the air thicker. The passengers continued to stare, their eyes hollow and void of life. She was trapped in this endless ride, with no end in sight. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of her mind, Ellie knew one terrifying thing. The last train at 3 a.m. wasn't just a ride. It was a descent into something far worse. A descent from which there was no return. The train continued to barrel through the endless tunnel, its momentum unrelenting, as if the very fabric of time and space had been torn open just to carry it forward into some uncharted abyss. Ellie's mind was reeling, her thoughts spinning in a frantic, hopeless spiral. There was no escape. There was no way off this train. She had tried to leave, had tried to open the doors, to cry out for help, but the train would not relent. It moved with a will of its own, a force beyond her comprehension, as if it were alive and she were just one of its unwilling passengers, a cog in a machine that could not be stopped. The passengers remained silent, their unmoving bodies frozen in place. But now, Ellie could see something in their faces. It wasn't just the hollow emptiness, the vacant eyes. No, there was something more, a subtle change. The corners of their mouths seemed to twitch, just barely. A slight shift in their posture, a minute movement that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Were they aware of her now? Were they waiting for her to do something, to make a move? Or was it the other way around? Were they waiting for her to join them? To become just as motionless as they were, just as trapped? She couldn't tell, but she felt a growing sense of dread, a sickening realization that the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to leave, to remember what it meant to be alive. The train rattled again, and Ellie felt a sudden cold wash over her. The air grew frigid, her breath turning into visible puffs that lingered in the space between her and the shadows around her. She wrapped her arms around herself in an attempt to stave off the chill, but it didn't help. The cold seeped deeper, spreading through her bones, until it felt like the entire car had frozen over. She looked at her breath as it escaped from her lips, watching the fog of it swirl in the dim light. There was no warmth in the air, no sign of life, nothing except the whispering, which had returned, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the other passengers anymore, though. No, the whispers were coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper within the train. The walls? The very metal of the train seemed to be humming, vibrating with a presence that sent shivers crawling up Ellie's spine. Her eyes darted around the car, seeking the source of the sound, but the whispers didn't form words, not at first. They were like faint, fleeting fragments of thoughts, snatches of sentences, incomplete phrases. She strained her ears, trying to understand. "Can't leave." The voice was faint at first, but it was clear now. A voice that wasn't human. Not entirely. It reverberated through her chest, making her heart race, as though it were coming from some deep, primordial place within the train itself. Another whisper, this time from the far corner of the car, barely audible but unmistakable. "You're not supposed to be here." Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the sound. The corner was empty, no one stood there, no one moved. But the whisper, the voice, continued, growing louder, as though the very walls of the train were alive with the murmurs of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. A shiver ran down her spine, and she pressed her back into her seat, her eyes scanning the walls, the windows, the ceiling, desperate for some sign of what was happening. Was the train haunted? Were these passengers ghosts, remnants of lost souls forever trapped in the darkness of the tunnel, bound to the endless motion of the train? And if so, where was she? Where did she belong in this nightmare? The air seemed to thicken, and Ellie felt a weight settle on her chest, suffocating her, pressing her deeper into her seat. Her hands gripped the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white, and her pulse thudded in her ears. The whispers were growing in number now, spiraling into a cacophony of voices, some familiar, some alien, some so foreign that she couldn't comprehend them. They all spoke at once, filling her mind with a flood of fragmented thoughts. She couldn't focus, couldn't keep up with the flood of words. They blurred together in a maddening rush. "You've come too late, you had to escape, waiting for you." The voices were relentless, filling every inch of the car, every inch of her mind, until Ellie felt like she was drowning in them. Her vision swam as the shadows around her seemed to stretch, their edges bending and warping like dark liquid, as if the very space inside the car was collapsing in on itself. A sensation of vertigo overtook her, and she slammed her hands against her ears, trying to block out the noise, but the whispers kept coming. Her breath came in ragged gasps now, her pulse pounding in her throat, her eyes darting between the passengers. The figures had not moved, but their presence had changed. They felt closer now, their hollow gazes fixed on her, their eyes unblinking. Ellie's mind screamed at her to do something, to act, to fight against this feeling of being drawn into something she couldn't escape. She jumped from her seat, her knees buckling under the force of her own panic, and stumbled toward the front of the car, toward the door. Maybe the conductor could help. Maybe there was someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. She gripped the handle of the door, pulling at it desperately. But it wouldn't open. It never did. She let out a strangled cry, her hands slipping from the cold metal as she collapsed to the floor, her chest tight with fear. The train continued to speed forward, its pace increasing, as though it were accelerating into oblivion. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a sudden flash of light cut through the darkness. It was fleeting, a brief moment of brilliance, but it was enough. Ellie's eyes shot to the window, her breath catching in her throat. For a brief instant, she thought she saw something outside. A figure, standing alone in the dark, a silhouette against the distant lights of a far-off station. But before she could blink, the light was gone. The darkness swallowed it whole, and the figure, if it had ever been there at all, was lost once again. Ellie's mind reeled. She was losing her grip on reality. She couldn't tell what was real anymore, what was a memory and what was a hallucination. Was there really someone out there, or was the train playing tricks on her? The train lurched again, this time with a violent force that knocked her off her feet. She hit the floor with a painful thud, her body crashing into the cold metal of the car. But before she could recover, something cold brushed against her hand. Ellie recoiled, her breath catching in her throat, and looked down. Her fingers grazed the cold, smooth surface of a face that wasn't her own. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest as her eyes slowly, terrified, turned to the passenger sitting closest to her. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, but they were empty. No pupils, no irises, just hollow, black voids. And for the first time since she had boarded this nightmare, the figure spoke. "Welcome home," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, barely a breath above a sigh. Ellie's world tilted again, the whispers filling her mind once more as the train continued to barrel through the endless tunnel, and she realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that she wasn't just a passenger. She had become part of the train. And there was no getting off. The train lurched forward, its mechanical groan echoing through the confined space, vibrating deep into Ellie's bones. She had no idea how long she had been on board now, how many stops had passed, or whether there had even been any stops at all. Time itself seemed to bend and warp in the suffocating darkness, and the longer she remained on the train, the more it felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist. She was no longer a passenger. She was just part of the unyielding, grinding rhythm of the train's motion. The whispers, soft at first, had now become a constant hum, a low, insistent murmur that filled every corner of her mind. They never stopped. They never ceased. At times, they were fragmented, like pieces of broken conversations. Other times, they were long, drawn-out sighs of frustration or despair. The passengers, still and silent, seemed to exude the same heavy energy, their vacant eyes locked onto nothing in particular, but Ellie couldn't shake the sense that they were aware of her every movement. She didn't dare to speak aloud, not anymore. The voices, the whispers, had warned her. They had told her she could never leave. And yet, even as the weight of that truth pressed in on her, Ellie's mind clung to one hope. There had to be an end to this. There had to be a way to escape. She had to find it. But how? Every instinct in her screamed to run, to do something, anything, to stop the suffocating crawl of time. But she had tried before, and each time, she had failed. She tried the doors, tried the windows, tried calling out, but nothing worked. No response. The train didn't slow, didn't stop. It kept moving, pulling her along in its never-ending journey through the void. And now, there was no way to tell if the world outside was real, if anything was real anymore. She pushed herself up from the cold metal floor, still dizzy from the fall earlier, and staggered toward the window. The scenery beyond was as black as the night she had boarded. She tried to press her face to the glass, hoping for even a flicker of light to break the monotony, but there was nothing, just darkness, stretching out in every direction like an endless void, an abyss with no end. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear, but the longer she looked at it, the more it seemed to distort, as if the reflection itself was shifting, melting into something else, something that didn't belong to her. She pulled away quickly, her breath shallow as the air grew colder. The cold was everywhere now, suffusing the very air inside the train, seeping into her skin and into her bones. It was the kind of cold that didn't just freeze the body. It froze the mind, the soul. It drained the life out of her. She couldn't tell if she was getting weaker or if the train itself was sapping the strength from her. But she felt it. The emptiness. The hopelessness. The pull of the train was deeper now, like gravity itself had begun to shift, drawing her in, anchoring her to a place where escape was impossible. She turned, her eyes scanning the other passengers. They had not changed. They never did. Still as statues, frozen in time, their eyes vacant but never blinking. But now, as she moved past them, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck, as if one of them was watching her, really watching. Her gaze locked on one figure near the center of the car, a woman whose hair hung in wet strands over her face, obscuring her features. Ellie's skin crawled as she slowly made her way toward her. Something about the woman felt different. There was a weight to her, an energy, that made Ellie's pulse race. The whispers seemed to fade into the background as she approached the figure, her heart pounding louder than the sound of the train. As she came closer, the woman's head lifted, her eyes meeting Ellie's with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. They were not empty, not like the others. No, these eyes were full of something Ellie couldn't quite name. The woman's lips parted slowly, as though the very act of speaking was a strain. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice hoarse, brittle, as though it had been trapped for too long. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribcage, her body instinctively stepping back, but the woman's gaze held her fast. "It's too late now," the woman continued, her words slow and deliberate. "You can't go back." Ellie's mind screamed. "What do you mean?" She wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. The woman's face was still half-shrouded by her damp hair, but Ellie could see now that her skin was mottled, grayish, like a corpse that had been left too long in the water. Her lips trembled as though she were struggling to form the words. "You'll be one of us soon," she rasped, and her hand reached out, a skeletal finger brushing Ellie's arm. The coldness of it was like ice, and Ellie recoiled instinctively, her breath quickening. "No," she whispered hoarsely, shaking her head as if to deny the truth of the words. But it was too late. The woman's eyes never left hers. "You're already one of us." The words seemed to sink into Ellie's very soul, like a poison, and for a moment, her vision blurred. She staggered backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it true? Was she already a part of this nightmare? Had she, too, become just another lost soul on the train, doomed to repeat the same cycle forever? The woman's form seemed to melt back into the shadows, and Ellie took a step back, unable to tear her gaze away. The whispers returned, louder than ever, as though the very air itself were alive with voices. "You can't leave. You never left. This is your home now." Ellie's breathing grew faster as she backed away, the walls of the train pressing in around her, the car closing in on her in a way that made it feel as though the train itself were a living thing, breathing, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that she could feel in her chest. It was alive and it was hungry. Her legs were shaking now, her body on the verge of collapse. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She wasn't just a passenger. She was part of something far worse, something that would never let her go. The train sped faster, its wheels screeching, the air growing colder. Ellie's mind screamed for an escape, but there was no way out. No exit. The doors were locked. The windows sealed shut. She had no choice but to stay. She was trapped. Trapped in the endless ride that would never end. As the train hurtled deeper into the abyss, Ellie realized the terrifying truth. She was not just traveling through a tunnel. She was falling through it. And there was no bottom. There was no end. Just a dark, endless void. Forever. The train had no destination. It was the destination. And Ellie had become part of it. The weight of the woman's words hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on Ellie's chest, suffocating her. "You're already one of us." The phrase repeated in her mind, each time sounding more final, more irrevocable. She shook her head, her heart racing. She couldn't. No, she wouldn't accept that. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't just a shadow, a lost soul trapped in this train. She was still alive, wasn't she? But as the seconds ticked by, Ellie began to wonder if she truly understood what alive even meant anymore. The train's relentless motion, its unyielding pace, had begun to gnaw at her sanity. She had lost track of how long it had been since she boarded, how long since she had seen daylight, how long since she had felt a sense of time outside of the train's cold grip. There was no beginning and no end, only the endless passage of tunnel after tunnel, the fleeting flashes of dim lights that painted the darkness in sickly hues, and the silence of the passengers around her. They sat in their seats like statues, unmoving, unblinking, but somehow still aware. As she moved past them, Ellie's eyes flicked from one face to the next. The expression on each face was eerily similar, hollow, lost, and cold, like the still surface of an untouched lake in the dead of winter. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. Waiting for her, perhaps. Her footsteps echoed through the car, as if each step were amplifying her isolation, her growing dread. She walked in a trance, her legs moving of their own accord, driven by some unseen force, her mind clouded by exhaustion and fear. But there was something else now. Something she hadn't felt before. It was the faintest shift in the air, an unnatural pressure, a heaviness that made her skin crawl. She stopped abruptly and looked around, her pulse quickening. The air was thick, as though the very atmosphere inside the train was pressing down on her from all sides. The whispers had stopped. It was so quiet now, so still, that Ellie could hear the faint hiss of the train's wheels on the tracks, the metallic screech of its movement against the rails. But something was wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. She felt it in her bones. A change. Something had shifted, and she was no longer sure where the train was headed, or if it even had a destination anymore. She approached one of the windows cautiously, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned forward to peer outside. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and ghostly in the dim light. Beyond that reflection, all she could see was darkness, an endless void that stretched out in all directions. The light from the train's windows flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. Then, without warning, the train slowed, the gentle squeal of the brakes reverberating through the car. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The motion was so unnatural, so abrupt, that it sent a wave of dread through her. The train had never slowed before, not like this. It was supposed to be moving at breakneck speed, never stopping, forever speeding into the unknown. But now it was almost still. The air had thickened even further, pressing in on her chest, suffocating her. She looked around, searching for any sign of what was happening. The passengers remained silent, as unmoving as ever, but Ellie could sense it. Their stillness had deepened, as though they were waiting for something to occur. Something monumental. As she stood in the center of the car, her mind racing, she suddenly noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. A figure standing at the far end of the car. A shadow, dark and indistinct, lurking just beyond the dim light. Ellie froze. This was different from the other passengers. This figure wasn't sitting still. It was moving. Slowly, steadily, as though it were drawn to her. She could barely make out the outline of its shape, but it was there, just beyond the edge of her vision, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. She didn't dare blink. The figure's movement was so slow, so deliberate, that it made her stomach turn. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away, but her feet felt like they were anchored to the floor. It was as though the train itself had gripped her, pulling her into its twisted embrace. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her throat felt constricted, her voice trapped somewhere deep inside her. The figure continued to inch closer, its form becoming more defined, more solid, with each passing second. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face remained obscured in the shadow. But its presence was suffocating. It was the kind of feeling you got when you knew something was about to happen, something awful, something beyond your comprehension. It was like being stalked by a predator that was always one step ahead, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. The figure stopped suddenly, as though it had reached some invisible threshold. Ellie felt her heart thudding in her chest, her breath shallow and rapid. She was paralyzed, her mind torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the horrible compulsion to stay still, to watch. And then, without warning, the figure lifted its head. Ellie's blood ran cold as she saw its face. It was a mask of darkness, a face carved from the deepest shadows, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. No mouth, no features, just the emptiness of a void. The figure reached out with one long, spindly hand, and its fingers brushed the air, as though it was searching for something. Ellie's legs trembled, her body on the verge of collapse. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, but the most prominent one was clear. It's here. This wasn't just a shadow. This wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was coming for her. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the air, emanating from deep within the figure's chest, sending a wave of terror through Ellie's entire body. The growl wasn't like anything human. It was raw, primal, and full of hunger. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet were like lead, and her heart was pounding so loudly that she thought it might burst from her chest. The figure's hand moved again, closer, and this time Ellie could feel the pressure of its presence, the darkness closing in around her. It's too late to run. The thought hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't escape. Not anymore. She had already crossed the point of no return. She was part of the train now, part of the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure reached out to touch her, its cold, skeletal fingers brushing her skin. The touch was like ice, freezing her to the core, and for a moment, Ellie couldn't move, couldn't think. She was paralyzed. As the figure's touch lingered on her arm, a strange sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't peace. No, it was something far worse, something that told her she was no longer in control of her fate. The train had taken her, and there was no escape from it now. The figure slowly retracted its hand, and as it did, the air around Ellie seemed to shift, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open and stitched back together again. She felt herself pulled into something, the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, the train's endless motion carrying her toward an unknown destination. She had entered a place beyond time, beyond reason, and now she was part of it. Just like the passengers who had been here before her. The whispers returned, louder this time, as if the voices themselves were reaching out, pulling her into their grasp. "You're one of us now. You will never leave." Ellie's body trembled, but she didn't scream. She couldn't. The train had already claimed her, and there was nothing left to do but ride the rails to wherever it took her next. Forever. Ellie's pulse hammered in her ears, her breath shallow as she backed away from the figure, but her legs felt as if they were moving through molasses. Each step was an effort, each movement a fight against an invisible force that sought to hold her in place. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest until it felt as though she couldn't draw another breath. She had been touched, marked, by the shadow, and a cold, gnawing sense of inevitability had settled deep inside her, crawling like ice in her veins. There was no denying it now. She was part of this train, part of this endless ride through the abyss. The other passengers remained still, their vacant, lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. But Ellie could no longer see them as simply passengers. They were something else now. Shadows. Echoes of a reality long lost, their existence as hollow and empty as the train itself. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her throat felt raw, her voice locked away as if by some unseen hand. The figure had retreated back into the darkness, but Ellie could still feel its presence in the air, like a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of her sight, waiting. Waiting for what, she couldn't say. There was no logic to any of this. No rhyme, no reason. Nothing made sense anymore. The train had become something else, something beyond comprehension, beyond her ability to understand. She gripped the edge of the seat in front of her, using the cold metal to steady herself. She needed to move, to find a way out, but she didn't know where to go. It was as though the train itself was changing, warping around her, its interior distorting and shifting as if it were alive. The walls seemed to ripple, the once solid surfaces rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. It was as though the very nature of the train was being twisted and reshaped. Every turn, every bend, every flicker of light seemed to lead her deeper into this place, this non-place, and every time she thought she saw a way out, it vanished, just out of reach. She stumbled toward the door of the next car, her body trembling with the weight of exhaustion and fear. The whispers had faded, but their presence still lingered, a hum in the background of her thoughts. The deeper she went into the train, the more she could sense the air growing heavier, thicker, as though the entire train was swallowing her whole. She reached the door and paused, her hand hovering over the handle. The doors didn't open on their own anymore. She had learned that much the hard way. It was as though they refused to open, trapping her on a never-ending ride through the dark. She steeled herself, gripping the handle with both hands and pulling as hard as she could. The door resisted, groaning and scraping against the tracks with an eerie, mechanical screech. But, after a moment of struggle, it finally gave way. A rush of cool air flooded in as the door swung open, and Ellie stepped into the next car. The change was immediate. This car was different. The shadows here were deeper, the air colder, more oppressive. It felt as though she had stepped into a different realm entirely, as if the train had somehow broken the very laws of reality. The passengers in this car were even more still than the ones before, if that was possible. They were frozen in place, their eyes wide open but not seeing, their bodies rigid as though they had been turned to stone. She moved cautiously through the car, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her from within. Something was off here. The smell in the air was thick, metallic, like iron and rust, and there was an acrid undertone that stung her nose. It was the scent of decay, the scent of something that had long been dead. Ellie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as she passed by the passengers. Their stillness seemed almost wrong, unnatural, as though they had been placed in these positions. The thought made her stomach churn. The sense of reality, of time, had become so warped here that it felt as though even the walls were suffocating her. She had to get out. She had to find an exit. But there was no escape from the train. She knew that now. It was as though the train was the exit. There was no point to any of it anymore. No beginning. No end. She was trapped in a cycle, a perpetual loop of darkness. A low, distant rumble reverberated through the car, and Ellie paused, her breath catching. It was the same noise she had heard before, the deep, guttural growl that echoed from the figure. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was something else. It was closer. Ellie's body tensed as she turned toward the back of the car. The figure was there again, standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. She could feel its presence before she saw it. The coldness, the sense of inevitability that filled the air like a storm gathering on the horizon. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, watching her with its empty, hollow eyes. But she knew it wasn't watching her. It was watching them, the passengers. Ellie's throat tightened, a knot of fear coiling in her stomach. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she realized. The passengers weren't looking at her. They weren't even looking at the figure. Their eyes were fixed on something else, something in the distance, something beyond her, something unseen. It was as if they were all waiting for something, as though the figure's presence was the signal, the catalyst for something much larger than her. A shift, a change, a revelation. The figure began to move, its slow, deliberate pace echoing through the stillness of the car. The passengers didn't react. They didn't move. They just sat there, as still as statues. Ellie wanted to turn and run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something far beyond physical exhaustion. It was like the train itself was pulling her in, refusing to let her leave, refusing to let her escape the inevitable. The figure reached the first row of passengers, its hand extending, long and skeletal. It touched the first passenger on the shoulder, and the man's head snapped to the side, his eyes locking onto the figure's. But there was no recognition in his gaze. No emotion. Just an emptiness, an absence. Ellie watched, horrified, as the man's body began to change. Slowly at first, but then more rapidly, as though he were turning into something else. His skin became gray, like stone, his limbs stiffened, and his features blurred, until there was nothing left but a shadow of the person who had once occupied the seat. He had been taken, and Ellie realized with a sickening clarity that this was the fate awaiting her. She was not just trapped in the train. She was being absorbed by it. The train was feeding off her. It was feeding off all of them. One by one, the figure moved down the line, touching each passenger in turn, and with each touch, another soul was lost to the train. Ellie could feel her heart pounding, the blood rushing in her ears. She was next. She knew it. She was going to be taken just like the others. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The coldness in the air grew sharper, more insistent, as the figure turned toward her. Its eyes locked onto hers, and Ellie could feel the pull, the invisible grip that tightened around her chest, around her very soul. You can't escape. You will never escape. The figure's cold fingers reached out for her, and Ellie's legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her breath ragged, her entire body trembling in terror. But then, just as the figure's fingers were about to touch her, there was a sound. A click. The train itself, seemed to shudder, as though something deep inside it had shifted. The figure paused, its gaze snapping toward the back of the car. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. What was that? The figure hesitated, its hands still inches from her skin, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she wondered if it was possible, if she could escape. But she knew deep down that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The train had its hold on her. And as long as she was on it, she would never be free. The sound of the click reverberated through the car, louder now, more distinct, echoing in Ellie's mind as if it were a warning, a call to action. The figure's cold hand froze just above her, as though some unseen force had interrupted its pursuit. It hesitated, its blackened eyes flickering with an unnatural intensity. For a moment, Ellie dared to hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe there was a chance for escape, a crack in the suffocating darkness of this infernal train that she could slip through. The figure's body remained eerily still, yet the air around them seemed to vibrate with an unknown energy, a shift in the very fabric of the train. What was that sound? It had come from somewhere deeper within the train. Farther down the line, perhaps from the very engine itself. The train had shuddered again, the rumble vibrating through her bones as if something immense was moving, something enormous, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Ellie's mind raced as she glanced around, searching for any hint of what was going on. The passengers were still frozen in their seats, each one more lifeless than the next. The figure's gaze drifted away from her, scanning the empty car, and Ellie, with a sudden burst of adrenaline, scrambled to her feet. She had to move, had to get away from it, this dark, consuming presence that loomed in every corner of the train. But before she could take more than a step, she froze, her heart lurching in her chest. The whispering had returned, only this time it wasn't distant or faint. It was inside her mind, threading through her thoughts like an insidious vine, wrapping around her consciousness. You are part of this. You will never leave. It has already begun. The voices were 1,000 voices, a cacophony of whispers that filled the space around her, blending together into a single, unbearable hum. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they slipped through the cracks in her thoughts, impossible to ignore. Each word, each phrase, felt like a blade against her psyche, slicing deeper into her. "You're one of us now." She gritted her teeth against the overwhelming weight of their voices, but the pressure continued to build, pushing her to the edge. She didn't know how long she stood there, her hands pressed against her temples, but the moment she tried to move again, the figure turned back toward her, its hollow eyes now glowing with an eerie light. It hadn't left. It wasn't leaving. No, it was coming for her. The figure's mouth opened, but there was no sound, only a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the train. The air around her thickened, coiling like smoke, suffocating, impossible to breathe. Ellie's legs wobbled as she tried to take a step back, but the shadows stretched toward her, long and insidious, swallowing up the space between them. She was trapped, cornered in this endless nightmare, with no way out. A sudden, sharp ding from the train's intercom cut through the silence, jolting Ellie upright. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling, where the cracked speaker had sputtered to life. The words that followed were barely audible at first, garbled and distant, but then, somehow, they became clear. "Next stop, the end of the line." The words echoed in her mind, the meaning crashing over her like a wave. The end of the line. Was this it? Was this the final stop? Was there a destination at all, or was the train simply endless? She didn't have time to think about it. The figure began to move again, slowly, purposefully, closing the distance between them. Its movements were like liquid, its body shifting unnaturally, as though it were less solid and more like a manifestation of the very darkness around them. Ellie's pulse quickened as she backed away, her mind spinning. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the coldness in the air deepened until it felt as though she were standing at the edge of some vast abyss. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. She had to get away from this thing. She had to find the way out. But the train had stopped moving. The dim lights flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out across the car, growing darker, longer, like reaching hands. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window, her heart sinking when she saw the blackness stretching beyond the glass. There was no tunnel, no end in sight, just endless darkness. No light, no sign of the world she had known. This was it. This was the end. The train had already passed the point of no return, and now she was caught in it, an unwilling passenger on a ride with no end. The figure was inches from her now, its body towering over her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. The suffocating presence wrapped around her like a vice, and she knew, with sickening clarity, that it would take her next. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. No one could hear her. No one could save her. The figure reached out with one skeletal hand, its fingers brushing against her arm, and Ellie gasped as a sharp, cold pain shot through her, like ice digging into her very soul. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled toward it, into the void of its empty gaze. The whispers were deafening now, and Ellie felt herself slipping, losing herself to the abyss. Then, just as she felt the darkness beginning to consume her completely, the train jolted violently, throwing her to the ground. The figure recoiled, its hands snapping back as if it had been repelled. Ellie gasped for breath, her chest heaving, her mind spinning. She didn't know what had just happened, but she didn't waste a second. Her body screamed in protest as she scrambled to her feet, stumbling forward toward the front of the car. The train lurched again, harder this time, as if it were being dragged by some invisible force, and Ellie's stomach lurched along with it. The lights flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced in erratic patterns, distorting the once familiar train into something alien, something malevolent. The intercom crackled again, the voice that followed somehow more garbled, more strained than before. Next stop, the end of everything. Ellie stopped in her tracks, her heart racing as the meaning of the words struck her with full force. The end of everything. Was this it? Was this the final stop? The end of the line wasn't just a place. It was the end of the train, the end of the passengers, the end of reality itself. The whispers, now a full chorus of voices, rose to a deafening crescendo in her ears. It's too late. You're already here. There's nowhere left to go. She shook her head, her mind swimming in the chaos of it all. The train had stopped. The figure was still there. But she refused to believe it was over. She refused to let herself be consumed. As the train lurched again, its vibrations shaking the very core of her being, Ellie turned toward the back of the car and ran. She ran like she had never run before, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs pushing through the heaviness of the air, fighting against the dark that sought to claim her. The train might be endless, but she still had her will. She still had hope. For now. And that was enough. Ellie's footsteps echoed through the train car as she ran, her mind scrambling for a way out, some semblance of a plan, but there was nothing. Nothing but the crushing certainty that the train would never end. Her breath was ragged, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward. The walls of the train seemed to close in around her, the air thick and suffocating with an unrelenting pressure. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, and though she tried to block them out, they seemed to invade every corner of her mind, every space she could retreat to. You can't escape. It's too late. She ignored them, focusing only on the sound of her feet pounding against the floor, the feeling of the cold metal beneath her shoes. She had to move, had to get away from the figure, from the shadows, from the passengers who were being consumed one by one. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached the end of the car and grabbed the door handle. She pulled with all her strength, but the door refused to open. The train had stopped, but not in any way that offered her a chance to escape. The door was locked, frozen in place, just like everything else. She slammed her fists against the door in frustration, but the metal was unyielding. The train felt like it was alive, like it was refusing to let her leave, as if it had become its own entity, its own world, drawing her deeper into its maw. She staggered back, her mind spiraling, her thoughts scattered. There had to be something. There had to be a way out. She couldn't die here, not like this. Not in this cold, endless night, trapped in a train that never stopped moving. Her eyes fell to the floor, to the cracks in the metal, the scratches and dents that marred the surface. Then, in a desperate move, she dropped to her knees, her hands fumbling around the ground, feeling for anything that might offer an escape. She scraped her fingers against the edges of the cracks, digging at the seams between the train's panels. Her hands were trembling, slick with sweat, but there was something in the gaps. She dug harder. Her nails scraped against metal, and she yelped in pain as one of them split. Blood seeped from the wound, but it was a minor injury, and she didn't care. The blood, the pain, it was all secondary to the desperate need to find a way out. Then, just as her fingers brushed against something solid, something different, a deep rumble shook the train once more. The lights flickered violently, plunging the car into darkness. For a moment, the train seemed to hold its breath. And then, the screech of metal. Ellie's eyes snapped open in horror as the train's interior began to shift, the walls groaning and twisting as if the very structure of the train was coming apart. She heard the sound of doors sliding open, but she couldn't see anything. The darkness was so thick it felt tangible, like it was wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its depths. And then came the whispering again. But this time, it wasn't just in her mind. The voices surrounded her, low and guttural, coming from the darkness. You are one of us. You will never leave. The figure was close now, its silhouette standing just beyond the veil of blackness. She couldn't see its eyes, but she could feel its gaze, cold, empty, all-consuming. And that was when it hit her. The train wasn't a place. It wasn't a mode of transportation. It was a prison, a conduit. The train had no destination. It was a loop, a cycle, an endless motion, moving forever through the void. And once you boarded, there was no getting off. There was no stopping it. The figure was a part of the train. It was the train, and the train was it. A single, unending cycle. And now, Ellie was part of it too. She had been consumed just like the others. She had thought there was an escape, that there was some way to break free, but now she saw the truth. The figure moved toward her, its form now tangible in the flickering light of the dying bulbs above. It was closer now, impossibly close. She could feel its coldness in her bones, seeping into her skin. She closed her eyes, preparing herself for the inevitable. This was the end. She wasn't going to make it. There was no escape. But then, the sound. A jolt, a screech of metal, louder than before. The train lurched again, this time with such force that Ellie was thrown backward, her body slamming into the floor. The lights flickered back on, blinding her momentarily. She blinked, dazed, and when her eyes cleared, the train had changed. The figure was no longer in front of her. The passengers, those shadowy, lifeless bodies, were gone. The car was empty, silent. For the first time since she had boarded the train, she was alone. The train had stopped moving. Completely. There was no sound, no motion. It was as though time had frozen. Ellie lay there on the cold metal floor, staring up at the ceiling in disbelief. She could hear her own heartbeat, pounding in her chest like a drum. It felt too quiet, too still. She pushed herself up shakily, her limbs stiff from the fear that had held her in place for so long. She stood, hesitant, uncertain. The train was empty now. It was like a shell, hollow, abandoned. She glanced toward the front of the car, her eyes catching the faintest outline of what seemed like a door at the far end. The final door. A part of her knew it was a trick, that this was part of the train's endless cycle, but another part of her, an instinct deep within her, knew she had to try. She walked toward it, every step feeling like an eternity. The door was there, and it was open. Beyond it, she could see the faintest glimmer of light, something different. Not the sickly, flickering light of the train, but a soft, warm glow. A glimpse of something real. With a deep breath, she stepped through the door. The air shifted. The temperature changed. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she felt free. She blinked. The world around her shifted, and she found herself standing at a subway platform. A real one. The one she had been waiting for. The lights were bright. The train was gone. It was still night, but it felt different now. The hum of the city buzzed in the distance. Her body felt lighter, free from the weight of the train, from the suffocating darkness. She looked around, blinking as the reality of her surroundings settled in. The platform was empty, but the train she had been on, the last train, was gone. And then, just as her pulse began to slow as she took in the fresh air, she heard it. A soft sound. A click. A door opening. She turned slowly. The train. It was back. But this time, it wasn't the same. The train was here, on the tracks, waiting, its headlights flickering in the night. And she knew, deep within her, that the cycle wasn't over. Not for her. Not yet. The train was always there, waiting. And when the next passenger climbed aboard, it would start again. The last train at 3 a.m. The journey was endless. And she was part of it now. The city continued to hum in its usual rhythm, unaware of the truth that Ellie now carried within her. The shadows, the whispers, the train, it was all part of a larger, unspoken reality, a cycle that never ceased, a loop that no one truly escaped. Ellie stood on the platform, gazing at the train as it slowly moved back into the dark. She didn't know what was real anymore. She didn't know if she would ever truly be free. But she knew one thing for certain. No matter how far she ran, no matter how much she fought, the last train at 3 a.m. would always be waiting.